The thing I remember most is how he came through the door without his rifle. He had carried that rifle up the ridge every November of my life and a few Octobers besides. And the one rule he held above all others was that you brought your gun home. You did not set it down in the bed of the truck and forget it. A gun left behind was a gun gone, he said. And a gun gone was a thing you had to explain to a man who had given you his trust the day he handed it down. So when he stood in the kitchen doorway that afternoon with both hands empty and his coat torn at the shoulder, I knew before he said a word that something had broken loose up there that I did not understand. His name was Walt Sereno, and for 31 years he had worked the maintenance crew for the county road department, which meant he spent his days grading gravel and clearing culverts and chaining up plows when the first snow came down out of the Bitterroots. He knew the back country the way other men knew the inside of their own houses. He could tell you which switchbacks held ice in March, and which creek crossings ran high in a wet spring, and which ridgelines caught the wind so hard the snow never settled on them. He was not a man who got turned around. He was not a man who spooked. I had watched him pull a dead doe off the highway at 2 a.m. in a sleet storm with his bare hands and never once raise his voice. And I had watched him set a broken fence post in frozen ground without complaint, and in all my years under his roof, I had never seen his face go the color it went that day. White. Not pale the way a sick man goes pale. White like the underside of a fish. White like something had reached inside him. I was 19 that fall, still living at home, working part-time at the lumber yard off the state route, and saving for a truck of my own. My mother had been gone 4 years by then, taken by a cancer that moved faster than the doctors said it would, and so it was just the two of us in the house at the end of Quarrow Lane, a low ranch place my father had built with his own hands the year before I was born. We did not talk much. We were not the kind of men who needed to. He cooked Sunday supper, and I cleaned the kitchen after, and we watched the weather report together and went to bed. And that was a life, and it suited us both. The ridge was called Hollis Ridge on the Forest Service maps, though nobody local called it that. They called it the Backbone because of the way it ran north to south in a long, unbroken spine of timber and rock, steep on the western face and gentler on the east, with a single old logging spur cut into it back in the 70s that had grown over so badly you could barely find it now. My father had hunted that ridge since he was a boy. His own father had hunted it before him. There was a saddle near the top, a flat bench, between 2 high points where the elk crossed in the early dark, and he had taken his bull there more years than not, and he knew every game trail and blow down and seep on the whole eastern slope. He left that morning before light, the way he always did, with his thermos and his pack and the rifle his father had given him, an old bolt action with a worn stock and a scope he had owned longer than he had owned me. He kissed the top of my head where I lay half asleep and told me he would be back by dark, and to get the wood stove going if the wind picked up. I heard the truck start in the cold. I heard the gravel under the tires. Then I slept another 2 hours, and when I woke the house was quiet and the day was gray and flat, and I went to work and thought nothing of it. He was home by 1 in the afternoon. He never came home before dark on opening week. The light was still high and pale in the kitchen windows when I heard his truck come up the lane too fast, faster than he ever drove that washboarded gravel, and the brakes chirped when he stopped, and the door slammed once. Then nothing. A long stretch of nothing. I had come home for lunch and was standing at the counter with a sandwich half made, and I waited for the kitchen door to open, and it did not. And the waiting stretched out long enough that I set the knife down and went to the window. He was sitting in the truck, both hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the closed door of the woodshed, like there was something written on it. I watched him for the better part of a minute, and he did not move, and then all at once he did, fast, fumbling at the door handle, like a man who had just remembered he was on fire. And he came across the yard at a near run with his coat torn and his hat gone and his hands empty. And his face was white. I asked him what happened. He did not answer right away. He went to the sink and turned the cold water on and put both hands under it and left them there, and his shoulders were going up and down with his breathing too fast. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out level and quiet in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. He said, "I'm done with the backbone. I'm not going up there again." I waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. He shut the water off and dried his hands on the dish towel, slow and careful, like the drying mattered, and he would not look at me. I asked him where the rifle was. He said he left it. He said it the way you would say you left a glove somewhere, except his jaw was tight and a muscle was jumping in his cheek, and Walt Sereno did not leave his father's rifle on a mountain. I asked him if he was hurt. He said no. I asked him if he had seen a bear. He said no. And then he said the only other thing he would say about it for a long time. He said, "There was something on that ridge that should not have been able to do what it did, and I am not going back to give it a second look." He went down the hall to his room and shut the door, and I stood in the kitchen with my sandwich going stale on the counter, and outside the wind began to pick up the way he had warned me it might. For 3 days he did not leave the house, except to bring in wood. He called in sick to the road department, which I had never once known him to do in 31 years. Not the winter he worked a plow route with the flu, not the week after we buried my mother, and the foreman called the house twice, wanting to know was Walt all right, and I told him my father had a bug and would be back Monday. And I heard my own voice make the lie. And I heard how easily it came. My father sat in his chair by the stove, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and looked at nothing. He kept the fire too hot. He fed it all day, splitting more than we could burn, and the house got close and dry, and he sat in the middle of it, still wearing his coat. Some afternoons like he could not get warm under it. He ate what I put in front of him, and not much of it. A few bites of the stew, the bread left on the plate. He slept with the hall light on, which he had never done, and twice in the night I woke to the small sounds of him moving through the house. The floorboards I knew by their voices. The one outside the bathroom, the loose one at the head of the hall, and I would lie there and listen to him, checking the locks on the doors. We did not have locks worth checking on, a place that far out, just the old hardware store bolts he had put in for my mother years ago when she got nervous about being alone out there while he worked nights, and I would hear him sliding them and testing them with a pull and sliding them again, the same door twice, 3 times, like the bolt might have come undone in the minute since he last touched it. On the 4th day I asked him straight out what he had seen. He was quiet a long time. The stove ticked. Then he told me, and he told it flat, the way he told everything. And that flatness is the only reason I could bear to hear it. He had gone up the eastern slope in the dark, the way he always did, he said, planning to be settled in the timber above the saddle by the time the gray came. The walking was easy and familiar. He knew where to put his feet without thinking. Where the trail braided around the big leaning cedar. Where the grade pitched up hard past the second seep. Where a root would catch a careless boot in the dark. He had his headlamp, but he barely used it. His legs knew the mountain. He had climbed it in fog and in snow, and in the kind of dark you could not see your own hand in, and his body did the work while the rest of him stayed easy and half asleep, the way it had 1,000 mornings before. A third of the way up he had stopped, because the woods were wrong, and it took him a moment to understand how. He stood with one boot above the other on the grade, and he listened, and what he listened to was nothing. No squirrels working the duff, no juncos ticking in the brush the way they did in the cold before light, no owl back in the timber where the owl always was. No wind, even though there had been wind in the yard when he left, enough to set the woodshed door tapping on its latch. Just a silence, so complete he could hear the blood moving in his own ears, a high, thin ringing under the quiet, and he had stood there in it and felt the first threat of something he did not have a name for, something that started low in his belly and climbed, and he had almost turned around then. He told me that twice. He had almost turned around. He wished to God he had. He was a hunter, though, and the silence could have meant a cat moving somewhere ahead of him, a lion working the same slope, pushing the small game ahead of it, and laying the woods quiet the way a lion will. A lion was a thing he understood. A lion was a thing a man could account for. So he went on. Slower now, more aware of the rifle in his hands than he had been, and he climbed to the bench below the saddle as the sky started to gray. He found himself a downed fir to sit against, the root wad at his back and the trunk running off to his left. Good cover, a place he had sat before. He settled his shoulders against the wood, and he laid the rifle across his knees, and he waited for legal light, and the cold came up out of the ground into him, the way it does when you stop moving. And he let it, because the cold was ordinary, and he wanted ordinary just then. As the dark thinned, he began to make out the shapes of things, the trees and the rocks, and the long pale run of the saddle above him, gray on gray, edges coming clear by degrees, and he sat there reading the shapes the way he had read them all his life, and he saw that one of the shapes was wrong. There was a stump at the upper edge of the bench that he had sat near 100 times. He knew its height and its shape. It came to about his waist, and in the gray that morning, the stump was taller than it should have been by half again, and the top of it was rounded wrong, and as the light came up, he understood that he was not looking at the stump. He was looking at something crouched beside it, something with its back to him, something the size of a man folded down on its haunches, but too long in the spine for a man, too heavy through the shoulders, covered in a coat of hair that held the gray light flat and gave nothing back. He did not move. He told me he did not so much as breathe. He had hunted his whole life, and he knew how to be still, and he was still now in a way he had never had reason to be before, because every animal part of him had gone quiet and cold and was telling him one single thing, which was that he was not the one doing the hunting on that ridge. He sat against the fir with his father's rifle across his knees, and he watched the shape, and after a while the shape moved. It did not stand the way a bear stands, front feet leaving the ground last. It rose. It came up off its haunches in one smooth gathering motion, the way you or I would rise from a low chair, and when it was up it was tall, taller than any man, and it stood there at the edge of the saddle on 2 legs, with its long arms hanging and its head turning slow from side to side as though it were reading the air. He could see the shape of the head against the lightening sky. It was wrong for anything he knew. The muzzle was long and the ears stood up off the top of the skull, high and pointed, and he sat there, 20 yards below it with his heart slamming, and did not raise the rifle, because some part of him understood that to move was to be seen, and to be seen was to be finished. It read the air for a long time. Then it turned its head and looked down the slope, and my father said its eyes caught what little light there was and threw it back. 2 flat coins of dull amber, set too wide apart, and they passed across the place where he sat and did not stop, And then they came back. They came back and they stopped on him. He said the worst part was that it did not startle. A deer that catches you startles. A bear that catches you woofs and pops its jaw and makes a show of deciding. This thing did none of that. It simply found him with its eyes and held him there. And he understood that it had known he was there the whole time, from before the light, and that it had let him sit and watch it because it did not care whether he watched. It was not afraid of him. That was the thing he could not get past in the telling. In all his years on that mountain, he had never met an animal that was not, at bottom, afraid of a man. This one was not. For a long moment, nothing happened. The two of them held there in the gray, the man against the log and the shape at the edge of the saddle. And my father said he made the only decision he had left to make, which was that if it came, he would shoot. And he began very slowly to bring the rifle up. It did not let him finish. It dropped. One instant it stood tall against the sky, and the next it was down on all fours and gone over the lip of the saddle. Fast, faster than the size of it had any right to allow, and the brush at the top of the bench thrashed once where it had passed and then went still. And then the sound came. He had heard every sound those woods could make. He had heard cougars scream and bull elk bugle, and the high broken yipping of coyotes on a kill. This was none of them. It came up from below the saddle, from the dark timber on the far side, and it was low at first, a rumble he felt in his chest before he heard it in his ears, and over the top of it rode a second sound, a kind of fast rattling chatter, so that it seemed to come from two throats at once, one deep and one quick, braided together into something no single animal should have been able to make. It rolled up the slope and filled the bench and the trees around him, and he could not tell how far off it was, and that was when his nerve broke. He got up. He left the log, and he left the saddle, and he started down the mountain, and somewhere in the first 100 yards he caught his coat on a snag and tore it and lost his hat. And he did not stop for either, and somewhere past that, crossing the seep where the trail dropped steep, he set the rifle down to get both hands on a root. And the chatter came again from up the slope behind him, closer, and he left the rifle in the mud and ran. He ran the better part of 2 miles down a mountain in the half-dark, a 56-year-old man who knew better than to run in that country. And he did not fall, and he did not stop, and he reached the truck and got in and locked the doors, which was a thing he had never done in his life at that trailhead. And he drove home too fast and sat in the yard, unable to make his hands let go of the wheel. And that was the day my father came home white. I believed him. I want to be plain about that, because a lot of what came after turned on the fact that I believed him from the first telling and never once thought the cancer that took my mother had taken something loose in him too. He was the most level man I have ever known. He did not invent things. He measured the world in feet and inches and pounds, and he distrusted anything he could not put a number to. And when a man like that tells you flat and quiet that he watched a thing rise up onto 2 legs and look back at him without fear, you do not argue. You go cold in your own chest and you believe him. What I did not do, and what I should have done, was let it lie. The rifle was the thing I could not get past. It was my grandfather's. A Springfield he had carried home from one war and hunted with through 40 years of peace, and my father had carried it after him. And it would have come to me, and now it was lying in the mud at the seep crossing on the eastern slope of the Backbone, going to rust in the November wet. I thought about the wet getting into the action. I thought about the bluing going to orange scale on the barrel, the worn stock soaking dark and swelling, the whole of it ruining a little more with every cold rain that came through. My father would not go back for it, he said so plainly. And he said it more than once. And there was no give in him on the subject, and I learned not to raise it at the table because of the way his face shut when I did. The more days that passed, though, the more it worked at me. That good rifle abandoned on the mountain, 3 generations of a family's care, left out in the weather to rot. And I told myself a story. I told myself the thing he had seen was surely long gone by now, moved on the way cougars move on, ranging miles in a night, covering more country in a week than a man could walk in a month. And I told myself I would go up in the middle of a bright, clear day with the sun high and get the rifle and be down before the light started to go. And nothing would happen, because whatever it was had no reason to still be there. And reason was a thing I still believed in then. I did not tell my father I was going. I have to live with that. I went up on the 6th day, a Saturday, with the sky a hard, clean blue and the sun throwing long November light through the timber. I took my own pack and a flashlight I did not think I would need and a folding knife, and I left a note on the kitchen table that said I had gone to a friend's because I knew if I told the truth he would stop me. And I drove out to the trailhead and parked beside the cold fire ring and started up the eastern slope in the full light of a clear morning. For the first mile, it was the most ordinary walk in the world. The woods were full of the small sounds my father's woods had been missing. Squirrels scolded me from the firs, that hard chattering complaint they make at a thing moving through their country. A pair of gray jays followed me up the trail the way they do, floating ahead from branch to branch, and looking back, patient and greedy, hoping for a dropped crumb. The frost was burning off the salal and steaming faintly, where the sun touched it, and the whole slope smelled of wet duff and pitch and the cold mineral smell of the seeps, and a raven went over high up talking to itself, and I heard it answered from somewhere off east along the ridge. I felt foolish for the weight in my stomach. I felt like a boy who had scared himself with a story and walked out in daylight to prove the story false, and the proving was easy. The morning was so plainly only a morning, and I made good time up the familiar grade with the sun warm on the back of my neck and my own breath loud and steady in my ears. I reached the seep crossing a little before noon. The trail dropped steep there to a black trickle of water over mossed rock, and the mud on the near side held tracks, my father's boot prints coming down, the long skids where he had run. And the rifle was there. It lay where he had set it down, half in the mud, the worn stock dark with damp, and I crouched and picked it up and wiped the action against my coat, and worked the bolt, and found it stiff but sound, and I felt a great loosening of something in my chest, because I had it, and the day was bright. That was when I noticed the birds had stopped. I do not know how long they had been quiet before I heard the quiet. That is the trick of it, the thing my father had tried to tell me, and that I had not understood until I stood in it myself. Silence does not announce itself. You become aware by degrees that the thing you stopped hearing has been gone a while. The jays were not following me anymore. The squirrels had quit. There was no wind in the high timber and no water sound except the small trickle at my feet, and the whole bright slope had gone as still and watchful as a held breath, and the sun was still shining, and that was somehow the worst of it, that the light meant nothing. I stood up slow with the rifle in my hands. I told myself it was a cat. I said, the word in my head the way my father must have said it, a lion working the slope, a thing I understood, and I made myself believe it for as long as it took to get the rifle loaded, which was not long, because there were cartridges in my pack, and my hands knew the work even while the rest of me had gone to water. I chambered around, and I stood at the seep crossing with the loaded rifle, and I made myself look up the slope toward the saddle, the way my father had not let himself look until the light forced it on him. Nothing stood at the top of the bench. The stump was just a stump. I could see it from where I stood, waist high and rounded and ordinary, with the saddle pale and empty above it, and the blue sky beyond. I almost let the air back into my chest. Then the smell reached me. It came down the slope on no wind, I could feel, which should have been impossible. A thick, low reek of wet animal and rot, and something underneath that I have never smelled before or since, sweetish and dark, the smell of a thing that does not wash and does not need to. And it rolled over me where I stood, and my stomach turned, and every hair on my body stood up. At once the smell was not coming from the saddle. It was coming from the timber to my right, downhill of me, between me and the trail home, from a tangle of blowdown and young fir where the slope fell away into shadow, and I understood with a cold completeness that whatever my father had watched at the top of the bench had not stayed at the top of the bench, and that it had not moved on the way cougars move on, and that it was below me now, between me and the truck, and that it had let me walk all the way up to this crossing, the same way it had let my father sit and watch it. I did not run. That is the only thing I did right, and I cannot take credit for it, because it was not courage. It was that some older part of me, the part that had gone quiet and cold, knew that to run downhill toward the truck was to run toward the blowdown where the smell was thickest, and to run uphill was to climb away from the only road home into ground I did not know in the failing edge of a day. So I stood. I put my back to the steep bank above the seep, so that nothing could come at me from behind, and I brought the rifle up and pointed it down the slope at the dark tangle of fir where the smell was coming from. The chatter started in the blowdown. It was exactly as he had described it, and worse for being 20 feet away instead of across a saddle. A low rolling rumble. I felt in the bones of my chest, and over it that fast dry rattle, 2 sounds from one source, braided wrong. And the fir at the edge of the blowdown moved, a single bough dipping and rising, though there was still no wind, and behind the screen of green I saw a darkness shift that was not the shifting of brush. Something the height of the lower branches drew itself together in there, low and patient, and the chatter dropped lower, and I understood it was deciding. I want to tell you that I saw it whole. The discipline of this is that I will only tell you what I saw, and what I saw was a long, pale flash of 2 eyes low in the blowdown. When the thing turned its head, set wide, throwing the bright noon sun back as flat amber, the way my father had said, in full daylight, and above the eyes a suggestion of a long muzzle, and the high points of 2 ears and a shoulder, one shoulder, rising and turning behind the fur, dark and matted and broader than my whole chest. That is all. That is everything I have. A shoulder and a muzzle and 2 flat coins of daylight amber in the shadow under the trees, 20 feet below me. Between me and the road home, I did not shoot. I have gone over that 10,000 times in the years since, and I still do not know if it was wisdom or cowardice. And I have stopped believing the 2 are as different as I once thought. The rifle was up, and my finger was on the guard, and the thing was there in the brush, and I did not pull, because pulling meant a wounded thing that sighs, coming up the slope at me, through 20 feet of blowdown faster than I could work the bolt. And not pulling meant we went on holding there. The 2 of us, the man on the bank and the shape in the firs, the same standoff my father had described. And I chose the standoff. I chose to wait. I held the rifle on the place where the eyes had been, and I did not move, and I did not speak. And I matched its stillness with my own, and the sun crawled across the sky above us, and the smell hung in the cold air. And I waited it out. I do not know how long. Long enough that my arms began to shake from holding the rifle level. Long enough that the shadows on the slope had visibly leaned over toward evening. And then, without any sound to mark it, I understood that the smell was thinning. The pressure of being watched eased off me by degrees the way it had come on, and the woods very slowly began to come back. A single junco somewhere uphill, then another bird, then far off, a squirrel. The fir at the edge of the blowdown hung still and ordinary. Whatever had been folded into the shadow there had gone, and I had not heard